Hi, Mary.
Hi, Raphael.
Thank you for doing this interview. You published 4 books on important, fascinating topics, and I'm very happy to have this conversation with you today.
I'm very happy to be here with you.
Let's talk a little bit about the beginning, when you earned an MFA from Yale, along with 4 other young women. And I remember interviewing the 5 of you, which have remained very close to this day. And you call yourselves the Birthday Club. Am I correct?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we were, all in the same MFA program at Yale, and we all became friends and stayed in touch after, and eventually started getting together to talk about photographs that we were making. And then started a tradition of every 5 years or so, for somebody's big birthday, we would give the birthday gal gifts of prints. And we've continued to this day doing that. And it's been an incredibly supportive group. Personally, it's probably kept me tethered to photography. When other things in life seem to get in the way, I could always come back to it and be right back with them, and be encouraged to keep working. So it's been incredibly important for me.
I can just imagine. Did you get to pick the image to get a print of, or was that a surprise?
Sometimes it would be a surprise, but now most of us give others the option to pick one if they would like to.
You were born in New Rochelle and you grew up in Larchmont. And having spent your formative years in the shadow of New York City, so to speak, you now live in North Carolina. Is New York tugging at you sometimes?
Sometimes, for sure. But in a way, being here has let me focus more on my work because there are fewer distractions.
Yes, I
Um,
can just imagine.
yeah, I mean, New York there's so much about the art world, and I kind of do better when I'm just focusing on my work and not really thinking about the art world so much.
And what you're doing and what you're going to do next and so on. Yes. But you do come to New York every once in a while for events and such.
For sure, for sure. And I have several family members who live there.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
go back pretty often, and it's great because then usually I can see the birthday club.
Yes.
Um,
They all
Several of the members are
congratulate.
based in the New York area.
You state in your website, on your website, that you are interested in how people find meaning in challenging situations. In Yale, you focused on portraits of people impacted by societal problems. And then you get a job interviewing mothers with HIV, and your mom herself was a geriatric social worker. What does finding meaning represent in your mind, and how do you experience it? Is it about looking beyond, or is it reframing hardships into blessings as gifts from above? What kind of meaning are we talking about? What would resonate with you?
Well, I think, most of us experience some degree of adversity and hardship in our lives, some way more than others. But I think it's I think that there's a lot to be learned from that, and people who deal with it most successfully kind of use it somehow to adjust their perspective on life, and you know, their priorities might change, and they might be, you know, take less for granted. And I mean, I can just say that, for example, my you know, having a son with a disability, in his case, Asperger's, and becoming very involved in the autism community, made me, it just really altered my perception about life and about what I value and what I don't value. And that's, you know, we can talk about more when we talk about my book, but and I'd say that's true of pretty much all the parents that I know, parents of autistic children. They would pretty much all say that, well, maybe not all, but the majority of them would say that it's almost like having a kid with disability in some ways is, in some ways well, there's a gift that you get, which is you appreciate more what you have, and you appreciate more people and more different kinds of people, and you see the value of more people. And that's a wonderful perspective to have. And, you know, nobody wishes a disability or, you know, hardship or difficulty on their kid or family member. But still, I do believe that there's a lot of positive that comes out of that.
Would it be fair to say that it sort of sorted things out for you?
That what?
It sorted things out for you.
In some ways, yes. Yes. It made me more focused on what was really important.
So in 1997, you published a book of images called A Positive Life, Portraits of Women Living with HIV. And besides the portraits, there are interviews with both the mothers and their teenage children, including interviews by River Houston, herself a visual artist living with HIV.
And a writer. At that time, she was more of a writer.
Did you learn anything new? Did it bring more clarity? Was anything in your life realigned somehow in the process?
Yes, I think in a way that was similar to my experience with autism. You know, there was such stigma at the time, and about AIDS, and to see how the women dealt with it, and those women, the women who agreed to be in the book and have their stories told, and the stories were the stories of the mothers, not the teenagers. For my other book, the autism book, there are stories with both by teenagers and parents sometimes, but in the book it was the mothers, but the ones that came forward and agreed to do it were really pretty brave, because then it was still, you know, this hugely stigmatized thing. And so they were amazing people, you know, and they felt it was really important to share their stories so that, you know, to help lessen the stigma. And it was an honor to meet them, you know, and to work with them and to hear their stories and to be able to tell their stories.
Did you live this experience, because it must have been intense? Did you live this experience in sort of a private way, or did you share it with those close to you? Is this type of experience an experience that we should all know something about?
Well, I would say both private and public. I mean, the book was public. I had a job interviewing mothers with AIDS and their teenage children for psychological research studies, and that was very intense. And it was, the majority of those women were very, very poor and lived in, sort of the parts of the city that were, the most economically disadvantaged part of the city. And that was a tremendous learning experience for me. And I felt like everybody should have an experience like that. People who didn't grow up in that circumstance would really, really benefit from seeing what that's like. It really, it really shifts your perspective to see something close up and for real, that, so you just have a different, much better understanding of what those families were dealing with.
Yeah, for a lot of us, it would turn the lights on in the room, really.
Yes. Although ironically, a lot of those families lived in very dark rooms, just literally, because I think it was a privacy thing.
Yeah.
They just often had all their curtains closed and shades drawn, and which wasn't great for photography. But we would open the curtains.
There's always the technical side.
Yeah.
So you were awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship and decided to join your husband, Clark, in Moscow around that time. It was the new freedom of the post-Soviet era. The urban landscape, of course, hadn't changed much. But your husband speaks of tremendous uncertainty and a sense of what he calls nedostroika, meaning unfinished building, and of marked nostalgia for the so-called good old Soviet days. Was this general malaise contagious? Did you catch it? What was it a plus in your work? Because you were photographing people in the streets.
I think it was the older generation that might have had that malaise. The younger generation
did not.
I would say did not have that. They were very much into Western culture and wearing the latest fashions and listening to all sorts of music and really, it was almost like a carnival atmosphere to be outside in the public parks and squares, and it was partly because of the housing shortage there. But yeah, once the weather got warm, everybody just went outside and life was lived outside, and there was really a kind of joyous revelry.
But that was in Moscow,
which I tried to capture in the pictures.
Yeah. What happened when you left Moscow? Because there must have been a substratum of something else.
Well, then there was the really bad collapse of the Russian economy then, which happened soon after we left. So that kind of made the end of the Eltsin era and the beginning of the Putin era.
Yes. So now you come back and you start teaching and you have 2 kids. And the family moves to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where you are now.
Mm-hmm.
and a new chapter, a new significant chapter starts for you. Your son Graham, as you said, is diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism. What went through your mind? What happened to your world at that moment?
Well, I think for most parents, when they first get that diagnosis, it's, it's frightening. There's so much stigma. People have such kind of stereotypical ideas about what autism is. I had that to some degree, although he was my son, so obviously I knew him well. So I probably didn't have that as much as some other people, but it's very tough in the beginning, and but pretty quickly I started going to support groups and getting very involved with the autism community, and that was just tremendously helpful. And those family, I'm still good friends with a lot of those parents, and a lot of them are in my book, my autism book,
Yes.
with their kids. And it's again, I think all of these families would say that they are so grateful that they have this community, and that it means more to them than almost anything else.
Did you draw on your experience, the prior experience with women living with HIV? Was that useful to you?
Yeah, I mean, I saw some parallels there, and there's obviously big differences, but I just kept thinking of the scarlet letter A, AIDS and autism. Again, they're very different, but in terms of the stigma and the misinformation, a lot of similarities there.
In terms of navigating feelings and emotions and circumstances and resources and support groups and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, just the idea that, being this kind of fear of talking about it.
Yeah.
That was a big similarity. And that's one of the reasons I did the book, because I feel it's so important to talk about it. It's, I feel like there are way more autistic people than people realize, both with diagnoses and without diagnoses. That category is mostly the people who are not intellectually disabled, people who on the face of it sort of seem neurotypical, but might be thought of as maybe a little bit quirky or a little bit rigid, or things like that. And I feel like this fear of talking about it leads to so many problems. It leads to people, not understanding what it is, not dealing with autistic people well. It leads to misdiagnosis or underdiagnosis.
Harms the kids.
How are the kids?
No, it harms the kids.
It harms the kids. It harms the kids. It harms the families. A lot of people, when they first who have their kids are diagnosed with autism, in cases where it's not obvious, some of the families don't tell anyone. Sometimes they don't even tell their kid's teacher, which is crazy. It's crazy, because there's so much that a teacher can do to help a student if they know that the student's autistic, and if they know how to help a student who's autistic. They don't always know that, but they can certainly learn.
So you start photographing autistic children, and eventually it becomes a book called Visible Spectrum: Portraits from the World of Autism. But this time you are directly implicated and you immerse yourself in it. Why was turning your camera on your own son as well as other kids a good idea? And was it easy to get to photograph other kids? Because I remember a time, as you mentioned, when prominent and even working class families built walls around relatives with any kind of medical disorder, especially children. No one brought it up in public.
Yeah. Yeah. That was certainly, a big question for me when I was thinking about doing the project was, how many people would agree to do it? And when I started photographing my son, mostly just because he was my son and I would just, would see him doing certain things that I thought would make a beautiful photograph. And so I made a few photographs of him early on, and I realized, without it thinking like, oh, this is going to be a project on autism. But I realized that those portraits that I made of him, for me, had a lot to do with autism, because he would be, he would often be in this kind of reverie state of mind. And, when he's having internal thoughts about his special interests. And to me, in those first few pictures I took of him, he was in that state. And to me, it was a very kind of beatific state of just pure happiness, really. And so I thought, you know what, this could really make sense as a project on autism if I photographed these other, a bunch of people, other autistic people, and that's kind of how it started. And because I knew a lot of families in the autistic community, several, a lot of people in the book are my friends or my friends' friends. Yes. I was pretty sure I could get them, they were all, because I knew them through support groups and I'm on the boards of a couple of autism organizations. And so I knew that most of them would agree to do it, would want to do it, and would be excited about it. And most of them were. So that was super important.
Did you get some doors slammed in your face?
I got some people who, just said, well, we don't want to. They weren't comfortable with the idea of it being in public. Yeah. Which I understand,
Protectiveness, I think.
What? Protective. Oh, yes. And then there were some people who were protective. But it's interesting that the vast majority said, that's a fantastic idea.
Yes. Really?
Because, and this was the same thing for the women with HIV that I photographed. They were all very involved in their community. And just as most of the autistic families I worked with were very involved in their community. And it was very important to all of them to go public in order to get rid of the stigma and to get rid of the misinformation. Like that was a huge motivator.
Yeah.
Because they love their kids and they want other people to see that, autism is not a disease. It doesn't ruin somebody's life necessarily. Yes, that can present difficulties, some for more so than others, but there's still a whole positive side to autism, to having an autistic family member. They can have a lot of strengths. They're super interesting. They tend to be very loyal and loving family members. They tend to be funny. They tend to have priorities that often line up more with adults' priorities rather than other children's priorities. And I'm generalizing here. Of course, not everyone fits this exactly, but
it's different, yes.
But there's and I mean difference too can actually be wonderful. It can be a good thing, you
Yeah.
know.
Yes.
They can see creative, you know, they're very creative. They can see situations from different angles. They can sometimes solve problems that neurotypical people couldn't because they saw it in a different perspective. And, you know, businesses are now hiring autistic people for this reason.
Yes. I read about it. Yes.
Yeah,
Well,
especially technology companies.
The clarity has a particular type of quality about it. Yes.
Yes, it's different. They see things in a different way.
You know, there's a sense of quietness infusing the beautiful images in your book. And the question that came up for me is that what's going on with these kids and their families? How should we read these images for those of us who are not implicated or involved?
I think the quietness was a result of a few things. One thing was that, you know, a lot of autistic people have high levels of anxiety, especially around people they don't know well. And they don't all love to be photographed. Some do, some don't, but they, I knew that it was very important that I make them as comfortable as possible, because if I didn't, they would have a negative experience and they just wouldn't want to do it. So to make them as comfortable as possible, I would go to wherever they wanted to go to, which was usually their home, and they could do whatever they wanted. You know, if they like playing with trains, they could play with trains. They could tell me about their special interests. I would always just kind of spend some time chatting with them or their parent, and, you know, so they would become comfortable with me. And a lot of times autistic people, you know, go into their head and have all sorts of, you know, things going on in their imagination, and they can look kind of
Removed.
Yeah, they can look removed, like they're deep in thought. And to me, that was that's something I, you know, saw in my son all the time. And for them, that's an internal refuge. And it's a positive thing for them usually, because they're thinking about their special interests, those things that they, you know, love thinking about and that they find fascinating and that they learn as much as they can about. And so I think a lot of the pictures ended up having that. Sometimes they would have that kind of look, possibly also partly because I would take, I'm not a very quick photographer. You know, it usually take me a couple of hours of taking pictures of them, and I wouldn't be doing it nonstop. I would be, you know, we might try different things or different places, like one room versus another room, or the backyard or the kitchen or whatever, wherever the light was decent. We might try a few different activities, but they would probably, you know, get kind of bored and just retreat into their own heads.
You know, a side question, as a photographer myself, I asked myself whether it's possible to use tripods with autistic children, because they may just pick up and go. How did you do it?
Yeah, I ended up almost never using a tripod for that body of work, whereas for the HIV project, I was almost always on a tripod. Now that was film versus digital, which didn't make that big of a difference in terms of tripod or not. But yes, one thing I know about autistic people is that most of them do not like to be directed. I mean, some of them do in terms of they like structure and stuff, in terms of say schooling. It's important to have strong structure for them. But just in terms of me coming in and saying, I'd like you to do this, they want to do what, it's important to them to be able to do what they want to do so that they can not be anxious.
So their sense of freedom is much more developed, I guess, than ours.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I think every parent of an autistic person knows that, you know, you have to work with them to do with what they are comfortable doing. And if you try to vary from that, it's not going to go well.
When your son Graham was asked what would the effect of an autism cure be on current people suffering with autism, he answers and says, I would die. Then someone else would wake up in my body. I would no longer hold my interests. I would lose all my friends. Without what made me, I would be a shadow of what I was. Ironically, I would be almost disabled, the very thing they would be trying to cure. I found that very enlightening and very touching.
Yeah.
Because the Graham tells us in no uncertain way that there's more than one reality in this world, and that each reality brings with it its own richness and its own set of complexities. How old was he then when he said that?
That's a very good way of putting it. I like how you put that. He was 13.
I was stunned.
I was stunned too when I read it. I just came across it. And yeah, it kind of blew me away. But there's a whole movement now, the neurodiversity movement. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. So non-autistic people, well, there are a number of people who have neurological conditions, like say autism or ADHD, maybe OCD, Tourette's, things like that, who consider themselves not neurotypical. So they are neurodiverse. So it's people who have, so there's a movement which is kind of branched out from the disability rights movement to say that neurodiversity is not necessarily a bad thing. In many instances, it's a good thing because it creates different perspectives, different ways of seeing the world that are equally as valid, often, to the neurotypical way. And there can be great benefits to having special interests, you know, that it creates much joy for them, and they can learn a ton, and they can be experts on things. And so basically, you know, I mean, it's very hard to separate. So this is, you know, if you say person with autism, it assumes that someone has a core identity and then this condition on top of that. Whereas a lot of the self-advocates now would say they prefer to be called autistic because they feel like autism is a core part of their identity. It's not separate, and they are not interested in being cured because autism is such an important part of them. And, you know, most of them are, I mean, yes, yes, they would definitely say it's a disability in some ways, but still they don't want to be cured. They just want to have supports from society, just like society provides supports for people in wheelchairs or for blind people or what have you.
You know, I've heard similar statements from people who are born blind or are deaf.
Yeah.
And the alternative does not interest them.
Yeah.
So 50 weeks ago, you posted the following on Instagram. Graham's robotic team was a finalist in state championship. It ranked second in North Carolina and qualified for the world championship. Headed to Houston to cheer them on. It's such a remarkable achievement, and frankly, not just for Graham.
Yes, yes. It was, and he's also done Quiz Bowl, been competitive in Quiz Bowl in high school and now in college at UNC. And those programs are fantastic. And they have provided so much joy and excitement and, friendships for him. And I would say that there's a certain number of both diagnosed and undiagnosed neuroatypical people on those teams.
Yes, for sure. Autistic individuals who fly under the radar.
Well, a lot of them gravitate towards technology because, the machines are easier to understand than people for them. They're logical. You can, take them apart and see how they work. Whereas people for them are, they don't understand the social cues and facial expressions and, subtle innuendos and this sort of thing. A lot of that, they don't.
Even with their family?
Innately, they have to be taught those things.
But even with their family and people who are close to them, they don't read.
Well, gradually over time, a lot of them learn these things, but they have to be taught.
Uh-huh.
Like I was photographing someone for the book, a young woman, and we were in her backyard, and her neighbor came out to her backyard, and the woman I was photographing said, "Congratulations, congratulations." And then the mother of the young woman I was photographing said, "Honey, you don't have to congratulate somebody every day when they've had a milestone," because I guess the neighbor had graduated from high school or something. He said, you could just do that once or twice, but you don't keep doing it every day. I love that example because it shows that the autistic young woman very much wanted to connect in a positive way with her neighbor, because there's this mistaken notion that autistic people don't want to connect with other people. That's not true. Most of them do. And they just don't always understand how neurotypical people do it. They don't, something as simple as that, she can learn that. She can be taught that, but she has to be taught it. She doesn't just get the rest of neurotypical people just kind of learn that over time by osmosis, by observing other people. And it's just because the way our brains are wired, we pick up on social communication, they just don't have that. They don't have that part of the brain wiring. So, like my son passes for neurotypical. Most people have no idea that he's on the autism spectrum, but there are quirky things that he says and does where people might say, I wonder why he did that, and that's why it's so important to talk about autism, so that people understand why sometimes autistic people do things that seem odd and, might seem, somehow disturbing or weird or, whatever.
Yes. You mentioned Virginia Satir, a legendary family therapist. And you quote her as saying, "I believe the greatest gift I can conceive of having from anyone is to be seen by them, heard by them, to be understood and touched by them. The greatest gift I can give is to see, hear, understand, and to touch another person. When this is done, I feel contact has been made. Is that what was done with Graham?
I hope so. I hope that's what I've done as a parent and a photographer. And I hope that's, you know, what the book does for all its subjects. You know, the book has narratives that go with each portrait, and the narratives are written by either the parents of the subjects in the book, or if the subjects were old enough and they wanted to, they could write about themselves. So that was really important because, you know, I wanted the autistic voices to be in the book. That was important. And I wanted to give everyone the chance to say what they wanted to say and about their experience and what they wanted people to know about autism. That was the only parameters I gave, were just whatever you want people to know about yourself and about autism. That quote actually came from a mother of one of the subjects in the book, who wrote this beautiful piece. It was actually Leah, the blonde young teenager sitting in a chair, and it's a very sort of dramatic portrait of her. Her mother is a psychotherapist, and she wrote this beautiful piece, and then at the end put that quote by Virginia Satir. And when I was working with the book designers, there was two different designers. The first designer separated out that quote and put it at the end of the book on its own page. And I mean, she took it away from the essay that the mom had written. And I asked the mom, I said, you know, this is an unbelievable quote, and it's super powerful. And the designer put it, you know, at the end of the book. I said, is that okay with you? And she said, yeah, sure, that's fine. And then the book went through another design where the other designer took that quote and put it in the front of the book and said, I really think this quote should be in the front because it really informs the way you're going to look at the pictures.
I think it should be in the front and the back.
Yeah. Isn't it a great quote?
It is. You know,
I mean,
my wife asked me to send it to her, you know, to email it to her. We're both admirers of Virginia Satir to begin with. Yeah. So yeah.
I mean, make it visible, you know. See you, right? I mean, that's what we try and do as photographers.
That's the very basis of sound communication with others, really. So that's something that I think everyone should get a chance to read, that quote. Yeah. So your latest body of work, called Game Lands, is a series of landscapes taken when you had to get out of the house because of the pandemic. It's a little bit different from the others. And you know, tell us something about that.
Well, it's funny because I never thought I would be a landscape photographer. For some reason, I just couldn't picture myself making landscapes. Both just in terms of being motivated by the content, and technically, I don't know, I had this idea that really, if you're going to do landscapes, you should use a large format camera, and I really did not want to use a large format camera. It's a very slow, methodical way of working that really would be difficult. And but I started going out in the pandemic just with my phone camera, and I live near a lake. I always thought that the trees around the lake were really beautiful, especially seen from the water. So I went out in a kayak. I would go on a kayak and take pictures with my phone of the trees. And also I had been very late to social media, but I had finally gotten on Instagram and realized that the photography community there is really pretty amazing. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll take pictures of some trees, you know, for Instagram. And that ended up actually was funny because trying to photograph from a kayak, it turns out to be a horrible idea because it's moving. And, I'd sort of line up the shot, and then the boat
Especially
would.
with an iPhone, which you don't have a very good grip on.
Well,
I can fall into
that's
the
why I
water.
had my phone instead of my real camera in the boat, because I didn't want to flip over and have the camera go in the lake. But yeah, so I'd line up a shot, and then the boat would move too much, and then I'd paddle around in a circle, and I'd go in that spot. Oh, didn't get it, and I'd paddle around. It's like,
The boat is always moving.
so I was like, okay, I guess I need to do this on land. So then I just went to this little swamp that's off the lake that's in my neighborhood, and I just loved it. I love, swamps are so evocative and poetic and just beautiful. And that led me to start looking for other swamps. And then that led me to waterfowl impoundments, which are hunting game lands where specific areas are intentionally flooded and drained, and crops are grown to attract the wildlife, and then they fill it with water, and then the ducks and things come and eat the stuff that's grown in the lake, and then they drain it, and then they grow stuff, and every year they do this. And so there's these little dams, and they're just really interesting to me because they're a really interesting intersection of man-made and nature, and also the whole idea about where we're going to attract wildlife and create these perfect environments for wildlife, but in order to kill the wildlife, that's, it's just, there's many different levels of complexity to that subject matter. Yeah. And then I just stumbled across these absolutely spectacularly beautiful game lands, not far from where I live, about half an hour away. And I go back there all the time. They're enormous. There's always, even just if I've been to the same areas, the weather changing makes like huge changes in the landscape. Yes. But it was so freeing not to photograph people, because I never had to make an appointment with somebody. I never had to convince them. I never had, I could just go whenever I felt like it. So it's just very ironic because I never thought I could do landscape, and now I'm just loving it.
Yeah, you can lose yourself in it too,
It's so beautiful to be outside. Yes.
Well, before ending this conversation, I want to mention that you have received several awards for your work, that your work has been exhibited and collected by several museums and art institutions, not the least of which are MoMA and Aperture Gallery in New York, and that the work has been published in the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, Time, Der Spiegel, and CNN. And thank you for your talent and your openness. It was a real pleasure to talk about your work and about matters that are important to you and to us.
Well, thank you so much. You have a very generous way of interviewing, I think, that is open to discussing all sorts of different ideas, not only photography, which can be great, and interesting, and ultimately is connected to the photography, right? I mean, because that's the content. So yeah, it was a real pleasure for me.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And be well.
You too.